So soy milk is more profitable than cow milk. Switching from cow milk to soy milk is ethically the right thing to do. We have no idea what percentage of the human race would be willing to make that switch for purely ethical reasons. But it turns out there are fundamental economic reasons for us as a society to make that transition, for us as individuals, or for individual companies to make that transition, right? I was sent a link to an article in Forbes magazine from just a couple of months ago by Mod Vegan. We talked about this within Patreon. I support her on Patreon. She supports me also on Patreon. Support is mutual. And we followed up a little bit by email. This article in Forbes magazine gives the statistic from Pennsylvania that the profit margin on cow milk is less than 2%, and the profit margin on soy milk, as made by Silk Corporation in the U.S., is more than 4%. So, in layman's terms, it's twice as profitable, roughly, to produce soy milk in that kind of high-end packaging, Western format. This is not Chinese-style soy milk. This is not Thailand soy milk. This is an all-American soy milk product, Silk. It's twice as profitable as dairy from cows. And the article points out in Forbes, quote, also keep in mind that the dairy industry receives subsidies which can keep prices artificially low. Indeed. The article's next bullet point is, quote, dairy production takes an incredible takes an incredible toll on the soil and atmosphere. Little slip there. Quote, handling livestock is no picnic, separating mothers from their calves, slaughtering animals, manure management, etc. My quote continues, we are simply not built to consume non-human dairy. The sole purpose of cow's milk is to grow a calf from approximately 90 pounds to 700 pounds in less than 2 years. Not only are humans the only species who consume milk after weaning age, we are also the only species who consume another mammal's milk. That sounds like vegan propaganda. That sounds like you'd read off a vegan website or in a pro-vegan book, but it's published in Forbes magazine. And why is it being published in Forbes magazine? Well, this is a business article. This is about the economic prospects of a transition, again, of one company, of one individual person, or the society as a whole, from cow milk to soy milk, almond milk, etc. I'm going to quote Margaret now. This is actually a comment she made on Patreon. If you pay $1 a month, you can join the conversation. Quote, I think there's a bigger point to be made in terms of economics here. A long history of studying the illicit drug industry as an historian. So just note, she has a background studying the history of drug trafficking, international drug trade in Colombia, South America, etc. Studying this history has made me very interested in how boycotts work or don't. Reducing demand does not directly reduce deaths. Instead, it reduces the profit motive behind those deaths. As Isel and Melissa point out, once prices drop to a certain point, culls are the inevitable result. Real change comes when profit is reduced and corporations and small businesses see greener pastures elsewhere. The fact that vegans are willing to pay an identical or higher price for soy milk, which is exponentially cheaper to produce, encourages people to shift to plant milk production, and this really does happen in the real world. I think dairies are the first place this is going to happen because the economics are so palpable. The sale of White Waves Food, it's the company that produces Silk, to Danone Corporation is a dairy corporation, cow milk corporation, is evidence of this. And market commentators, not vegans, have been quick to point out the attractive margins of plant-based foods, even when subsidies are taken into account. I think this is a critical piece of the economic situation that's being ignored. And she then says, time for me to make a video, I guess. So she may make her own video discussing this. Okay, in this follow-up discussion I had with her, she mentions that she identifies as a negative utilitarian and an economic determinist, and she describes her own approach to these issues as fundamentally economic, whereas mine may be more fundamentally political. So I counter her thusly. This type of economic logic addresses some issues within veganism and not others. It fits very well with this specific example of the total production cost of soy milk versus cow milk. It does not even fit that well when we're looking at the ecological impacts of, for example, almond milk and the production of almonds. That was an embarrassment to many vegans. People would always raise the fact that, there were water shortages in California, and yes, vegans could point to all the water being wasted in the production of dairy milk, of cows, beef, etc., but the other side could point to the production of almonds, right? Now, economic outcomes are sometimes measured in dollars and cents, and they're sometimes measured in liters of water. All these measurements matter economically. So yes, this specific example favors our case. Specifically, soy milk is more economically efficient and, of course, more ecologically efficient than production of dairy milk. However, other examples are much further afield than the almond industry or almond milk or what have you. Think about the contrast between national parks and animals being kept in a circus. Circuses can be profitable. Circuses can, in theory, make a lot of money. I mean, they're not a charity. Even zoos, in some cases, zoos are profitable. In some cases, they rely on government handouts, scrape by, or go out of business. So the economic logic, although it may favor soy milk over cow milk, does it favor circuses or national parks? National parks where animals are preserved in the wild, still have their freedom and their dignity, as opposed to zoos where they put on a performance for humans. Or circuses, even more extreme. Yeah? Now, even if you compare two zoos, let's say we have two different zoos, and one zoo is trying to replicate wild habitat, animals with wild behaviors. You have a zoo that is, as much as possible, let's say, engaged in species conservation work, legitimate research, trying to keep endangered species from disappearing from the world, and is doing so by lovingly recreating the types of conditions in the wild where these animals might live, but not the types of conditions that are most entertaining to human visitors. And let's say you have a second zoo that's step by step closer to being a circus, where that's not their emphasis. They try to have the most exciting animals and have those animals doing things that are exciting to people. Here in China, I've seen a zoo where human beings can pay money to put meat on the end of a stick, like as if they're going fishing, like a fishing pole, and dangle the meat in front of a tiger, in front of a whole bunch of tigers in a tiger pit. So the tigers jump up and grab the meat, and the humans are entertained. So this is a zoo. It's not a circus, but this is... Now, which one is more profitable? Habitat conservation style zoos or more exploitative, more entertaining? And again, it'll even matter with what types of animals are there. I mean, some zoo is going to choose a type of, the pygmy hippopotamus from Africa and say, well, this is an important species to conserve for all these reasons, and maybe there were endangered species concerns or there were research reasons to have this animal in this enclosed habitat. Well, that's not really what people want to see. People maybe want to see lions and tigers. Maybe they want to see lions fighting against tigers, or where you can throw meat to the tigers and watch them leap up and catch it and this kind of thing. Same zoo in China, they had baby tigers that children were allowed to pet and pull the tails of. And I remember my translator who was with me, she was especially offended by that. She said bitterly that she hoped one day one of the baby tigers would attack the children and then the exhibit would be canceled because she found it so morally disturbing to see the tigers exploited this way. Economic logic is not always going to favor our case in veganism. It's powerful and important to note the instances in which it does. And I think Mod Vegan is aware. I've really kind of clashed with and harshly condemned some of the far left-wing vegans who assume that our situation in veganism is one of outright conflict with capitalism as such, the capitalist system. It's not true at all. Very obviously, factory-farmed meat is more economically efficient than free-range meat or than hunted meat even, right? When you do the numbers, this is included, by the way, in all the standard websites that address so-called water footprint of meat production, and also air pollution and what have you. But water footprint, those are the easiest statistics to get. Water footprint and also land use. So how many acres of land you need, how many thousands of liters of water you need to produce 1 kilogram of beef. The most efficient way to produce that meat is in the horrible factory farm system where they are indoors the whole time, They never go outdoors. They live very short lives. That's one of the main differences in economic efficiency on concrete and steel. And by contrast, places where they have more of a traditional free-ranging agriculture, sometimes just due to poverty, sometimes in the third world countries, or sometimes producing this as a luxury product, the ecological impacts are much, much, much worse. So again, a purely economic argument, factory farming looks efficient because it is efficient. It's ruthlessly efficient. It's a much more efficient way to produce meat, both in terms of the economics, profitability, and in terms of ecological impacts. Now, if you're having trouble imagining why that is, you can have a factory farm that has pigs living for as little as 3 months. 3 months, 4 months, 5 months. Very, very short life, very miserable life. The pigs are born. They live their whole lives in a horrible steel cage. You've probably seen video of this or photographs of this. This is unbelievable moral obscenity. But yes, that is those pigs will eat less food and drink less water for each pound of meat they produce than a free-ranging pig that has to live for a longer time to be raised in perhaps more pleasant circumstances, et cetera, et cetera. So there are cases where economic logic favors vegans, and there are cases where it doesn't. Now, I think most people are trying to make an economistic argument for veganism. Will say, well, yes, but we can compare all that. We can take all meat production in one category and then compare it to the economics and ecological impact of tofurkey, of having tofu simulating meat. And you can. But of course, very quickly you're getting into ethical arguments, ecological arguments, and indeed health arguments for why people should make that change. Because tofurkey is not in the same category as meat. I mean, it's really not. It's very hard to convince people that soy milk and cow milk, that one can be substituted for the other. But obviously, a real steak from a real dead animal is not directly comparable to a tofu-based alternative or what have you. So this is an uphill battle. I think also there's a deep assumption here, which I have addressed repeatedly on this channel, that vegan products are in a position to make non-vegan products, to make meat obsolete. It sounds great. Let's make meat obsolete. I think there is a real sense in which soy milk makes cow milk obsolete. I'd agree with that example. It's a convenient example, 100%. I think there is a real sense in which now modern shoes, the new type of shoe, simply makes leather obsolete. 500 years ago, to actually make shoes without leather was quite a tricky thing. The materials we have now, with any high-end sports shoe, Adidas or Puma or what have you, when you look at performance footwear that's made, whether it's for the military or for sports, they're using all vegan ingredients, various high-tech plastics, and mostly artificial materials, sometimes canvas or what have you. It's very clear that leather is now obsolete. Not only can you replace leather with vegan materials, the vegan materials are better, right? And of course, in various ways, I can say soy milk is better than cow's milk also. You can't say that about vivisection. I just made a video in which I drew attention to the fact that I was quoting scientific sources that had unearthed and proved scientific facts by torturing rats to death in a laboratory. It's not that easy. Unfortunately, there is no tofu rat that can replace the real rat being tortured to death in the pursuit of that scientific knowledge. I think it's really important to point out the situations in which we can't make meat obsolete, in which we can't make the exploitation of animals obsolete, where obsolescence may not favor our case. The substitutability hypothesis relies on obsolescence. And some things vegan products can make obsolete, and some they can't. Now, a few points that I'm sure Mod Vegan would agree with, or she'd 90% agree with. What we're up against here is indeed partly government subsidy, and the solution to that is going to be 100% political. Ultimately, we have to make governments feel ashamed to support the dairy industry the same way in the past they were made to feel ashamed about supporting the cigarette industry. That's going to be a huge change, right? And government subsidy, I mean, obviously this is partly economic, but the decisive element here is political and moral. There's no other way to repeal those subsidies. There's no other way to bring about the kind of economic change he's pursuing aside from, this kind of cultural and political change. Number two is the question of culture. Culture is very, very resilient in the face of economic irrationality. What can I tell you? If people decide that culturally it's really meaningful to go out in a boat and go fishing, some cultures feel that way. You may know some people feel that way. For a father and son to go out in a boat and kill a fish and eat it, they don't even calculate how much that fish cost. Like, okay, what? You had to go and rent a cottage and rent a boat. If you add up the amount of money a family spends going and getting their own fish, it can be astronomical, and yet they'll do it anyway. Right? So cultural values, there are examples of this. In Japan, they're struggling against driving their own eels to extinction. People will pay any price for eels. In some cultures, people will pay any price to go hunting or fishing or what have you. The cultural change we're aiming at, again, I don't think she would disagree with this. It's a question of priority. It's a question of where do we go from here. The cultural struggle, in many ways, is more powerful than the economic struggle. Sorry, that's not really a clear way to put it. The changes in cultural values will prompt people to recognize the underlying economic reality, but conversely, cultural values will completely blind people to economic reality and will prevent them from making the right decision. And we see examples also where these two factors are combined, the problem of government subsidy and the problem of cultural values. Once you get into questions of, within a country like Canada, government funding for culture and the arts, government funding for cultural heritage, then we're into a very strange sphere where budgets can be infinite, they can be in the millions of dollars, and the question of, what were the policy outcomes we were pursuing when we put this budget in place, it can be very, very hard to negotiate or debate the way governments spend money once they get involved in a sphere that's entirely based in cultural values. I used to be involved with First Nations politics, languages, and what have you, and you really would have a situation where you'd sit down and look at the government's budget and say, well, what is the justification for the government of Canada putting millions and millions of dollars into imitating European opera, European ballet, European high culture, and only coming up with a second-rate or a third-rate imitation of European high culture? Can't we get some millions of dollars to have first-rate Indigenous culture, to do something unique and distinctively Canadian, by which I mean something distinctively Cree or Ojibwe or Mohawk or Dene or Inuit? If we put the money in that direction, then at least we're funding something that really is uniquely Canadian. Canada is always going to be the very best place for Inuit statues, or we're not going to be a second-rate imitation of something that's in Italy or Europe. Those are very, very, very tough, issues to negotiate. And I think it is because we're into this twilight zone, this really strange no man's land, where we've become detached from the logic of the free market. A world defined entirely by government subsidy on the one hand and cultural values on the other. When we get involved in politics, when we first get involved, I think that a lot of us imagine that what we're going to be debating are differences of opinion or different facts, that two sides of the debate will have access to different facts, and in the course of debating, each side will expose the other to facts they may not have had. On the contrary, I think, as we mature, a great many of our debates in politics are instead about differences in priority and differences in how we interpret and implement the promises we make, what type of actions are lurking behind our words, which we may not know ourselves until we've really debated it fully. That's one of the reasons why political debate is so important. So, Maud Vegan, in her email to me, she mentioned in passing that only a tiny percentage of people will ever become vegan just because it's the right thing to do. Interesting point. I respond to that. For me, the priority is, right, great. I want to work with that tiny minority of people. That's where I see the way forward in terms of the pursuit of cultural change and lobbying for political change. Okay, so how many thousand people are we talking about in all of Canada or in all of the world, right? And in a sense, she's right. The number of people who will be swayed by purely moral arguments, deontological arguments, for any of the fancy word, the number of people who will be committed to veganism, to doing the right thing just because it's the right thing to do, is much smaller than the number of people who will be swayed by economic factors. And that's where her interest lies, or in engineering some of those economic factors, or working with those economic factors to bring about change in a larger segment of society. you can say it's a tiny number of people who are interested in veganism doing the right thing. I have the experience of being interested in human rights and human rights law. How many people are human rights lawyers and are interested in the human rights of the Cree and the Ojibwe? In the whole world. Is it even 15 people? See, how many people are human rights lawyers interested in helping the Cree and Ojibwe, and they're not just out for money? They're interested in doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. In all of Canada, is it 2 people, 6 people? It's this very, very small number of people. So many of the issues that in the past I've done research on, and where I've been interested also in, militating for political change, there's a tiny, tiny number of people with a sincere, positively engaged interest. Even amongst human rights lawyers, there would be more of them interested in resettling refugees or new immigrant issues or what have you. And be like, well, I'm looking for the tiny minority within this field that's really interested in First Nations. That's tough. So from my perspective, that's not such a tiny minority of people. And then, as always, there's the question of what is the difference that I can make? From my perspective, mod vegan is partly right and partly wrong. You can make a big difference in those cases that fall neatly into the economics category. And those are cases where veganism can make meat obsolete, where soy milk can make cow's milk obsolete, etc., and where the logic of market efficiency is on our side. But then there are all these other cases where it's not, where it falls outside of that category, whether we're talking about vivisection or the logic of factory farming itself. What's the difference you can make? It's going to be different for different people. It's going to depend. The position you can play, it's going to reflect the educational background you have and the position you're playing right now. For many of us, I think it's going to be militating for cultural change and political change. That's the way we can, as individuals, make a difference. In terms of the sphere of economics, if you don't have the chips on the card table to start your own business, to make your own company, to make plays in the market, simple as that, then I don't think you can be anything more than a passive observer and commentator as those market forces play out.